This battered but beautiful body was brought back from war-torn Italy over 70 years ago by Emily's granddad. She's hoping Will's managed to rebuild it. She could present it back.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Can I please ask if you have your audio on and you're not speaking, can you please mute yourself? We are expecting, we have 170 registrants, so it will be quite confusing if we have a lot of background noise. Thank you. So, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Juliana Carvalho. I'm the lead Access Matters Aotearoa campaigner, and I will be the facilitator this evening for this online panel, The Accessibility for New Zealanders Bill, Transformational or a Missed Opportunity. I will briefly describe myself. I am a white female with blonde hair and dark eyes. I'm wearing a black top and my background is blurred. I want to welcome you all and just to do some housekeeping before we start. As I said, this is a Zoom meeting, so it's not a webinar. And we had over 170 registrations. So please keep yourself on mute and your camera off. And when we had the time to do the questions and answers, then you have two options. You can either put a question on the chat, or you can use the button to raise your hand and wait until I let you to speak and address your question and pass that to the panelists. So the purpose of this panel, co-hosted by AUT and Access Matters Aotearoa, is to discuss the Accessibility for New Zealanders Bill from a legal perspective. And I just want to briefly share Access Matters opinion, let's say, about the bill. So this legislation, as currently drafted, lacks standards and regulatory control. Essentially, it is about establishing a committee to establish another committee and making recommendations for the sake of recommendations with no guarantee of action. In short, it's like a legislative pat on the head that denies the discrimination inherent in many aspects of daily life for 1.1 million people in this country. We understand that the realization of a truly inclusive and accessible Aotearoa New Zealand requires strong legislation and the engagement of our entire society. And even in the best case scenario, it will take many years to see progress. It is complex, it's challenging, but the rewards of ensuring equal opportunities for all and not leaving anyone behind will pay off for our collective efforts. So thank you so much for our panelists joining us today. We have Dr. Esther Woodbury, Lead Advisor Disability at the Human Rights Commission, Dr. Lida Ayoubi, Senior Lecturer at the Law School at AUT, Olivia Kelly, Senior Lecturer at School of Public Health and Interdisciplinary Studies at AUT, Jonathan Mosen, CEO of Workbridge, and Warren Forster, barrister and researcher, and he's one of the co-authors of the Making New Zealand Accessible, a Design for Effective Accessibility Legislation report. So let's get on to it. The first round of questions, I would like to know what is each one of you initial assessment of the Accessibility for New Zealanders Bill. So each speaker will have 4 minutes. And if you are passing your time, I will just make you call your attention so we can keep us on track. So let's start with you, Olivia Kelly, Senior Lecturer at the School of Public Health and Interdisciplinary Studies at AUT. Olivia, please, can you share your initial assessments for the bill?
Kia ora, Juliana, and tēnā koutou katoa to everybody else. So my role here in this early part is to outline the basis for the rest of the discussion. It's possible that not all of you have read the bill, so we thought it would be a good idea to explain exactly what's in it before the rest of the panel expands on what's perhaps missing or what could be different about it. So the bill was introduced into Parliament on the 28th of July. It's gone to the Social Services and Community Select Committee, and it's the role of that Select Committee to accept and review submissions on a bill. The submissions can be in writing, and the committee can also hear from people who have asked to make an oral submission. Submissions for the bill close on the 7th of November, so that's quite soon. After that, the committee will consider the submissions and write a report for the whole of Parliament, and this will include any suggested changes to the bill. The report's due back from the committee by the 16th of May next year, so they've got quite a few months to put that together. The bill's really short. It only has 27 sections, and it's set up in the following way. Firstly, it establishes what's called a ministerial advisory committee. And this is a certain type of structure that is set up to give the minister advice. The bill calls this the Accessibility Committee. There are 2 nomination panels for community and for Māori to nominate people to the final committee. And this is what Juliana was referring to when she talked about a committee to provide membership to another committee. In the bill, the Accessibility Committee's main role is to provide advice and recommendations to the Minister about accessibility barriers and practices. This is based on a work program under which barriers or practices are identified and options to address them are set out. It requires the committee to consult widely when developing recommendations. It gives the committee the power to formally request information from different areas of government. So that's the Accessibility Committee. It's safe to say that the detail of that takes up most of the bill. Secondly, the bill sets up what the Minister calls accountability measures. So once a year, the Accessibility Committee reports on progress made on their recommendations across the public service and the government. That report goes to the Minister, who then presents it to Parliament as a kind of scrutiny measure. The Minister's relationship to the committee is set out, and that includes telling the committee how the government is going to respond to or act on their recommendations. Also, the role of the Chief Executive of the Ministry in relation to the committee is set up. So that includes providing advice, technical support through advisory committees, and administrative support. Finally, there are 5 yearly report requirements built in. These are independent reviews setting out whether the Act functions as intended and whether any changes are needed. So that's a very quick overview of what's in the Act. I'll hand it back to the panel to consider what's missing or what could have been done differently in its design.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for setting the scene. Sorry, please, can I have, I think, Lauren, can you mute yourself, please, or IT, can you mute her?
Can you mute it, Sarah? Can you mute it, please? Microphone.
Mute the microphone, please. Okay, now I will pass the word to Dr. Lida Ayoubi to talk about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and also talk about international elements. Thank you, Dr. Lida.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Lida Ayoubi toko inua no Irana o ko tōpuna ke te noho au ki Makoro he pukenga matoa au I te wānanga aranui tamariki Makoro. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lida Ayoubi. As Juliana said, I'm a senior lecturer at AUT Law School. I am female, have dark hair and eyes, and I'm wearing a green top, and my background is my home office. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank my fellow panelists, and thanks Olivia for that very great and summary of the bill. And I thought what I would just focus on today, as we have heard again a summary of the bill, and we're going to hear more about sort of the shortcomings of the bill and other alternative approaches that are available and would produce a more effective piece of legislation on accessibility already from the other panelists. And so I would just focus briefly on some of the main points of inconsistency between the bill and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And so most of you would know that New Zealand was quite pivotal in the adoption of the convention. We took a few years to adopt the optional protocol that allows for individual complaints to be brought, but we did accede to the optional protocol in 2016. And the Committee on CRPD has heard a number of individual complaints from New Zealand and New Zealanders with disabilities. So the first point really is just driving point home that an effective legislative framework for accessibility is extremely important. So under the convention, and as this has been repeated by the committee in its general comments, in its concluding observations on different countries, including on New Zealand, we know that the convention requires all parties, including New Zealand, to take all appropriate measures. And when we talk about all appropriate measures, we mean legislative measures, policies, regulations, guidelines, and so on. And this is partly to either, again, adopt laws or modify existing laws that would eliminate barriers to access and would facilitate access on an equal basis with others. And in the absence of a written constitution in New Zealand where discrimination or accessibility will be recognized, we do really need the right to accessibility or the right to access to be incorporated in our domestic legislation. Can I just ask again if there is someone who hasn't muted their mic to please do so?
Sorry, can IT, can you give me a co-host? Can you put me as co-host and I can help to mute anyone that might be? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And we have more than ample evidence that New Zealand's current legislative framework or approach is not suitable, is not sufficient. So the government should be taking further legislative approach. And this is a point, or this would be an answer to those who might advocate for a more flexible approach or an alternative approach that focuses on, again, maybe a non-binding and soft guidelines or regulations for providing accessibility. And while those are valuable, again, the convention and the committee and also sort of examples of good practice tell us that a legislative framework is essential and it's important. For instance, research from UNESCO shows that even when accessibility guidelines or standards exist in different countries, they're seldom conducted, they might not be enforced. And also research from the UN Special Rapporteur, former Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities shows that again, standards or guidelines, anything out of a legislative framework might be quite fragmented, and there would be a lack of effective coordination between different sectors. So this is why clear standards in the form of legislation is important. And for instance, in the European Union, while again, standards or guidelines on accessibility have existed for many years, we see that a single directive that coordinates all of that is now being adopted to create legally binding legislation on the issue. And we also know from, again, the UN that a very important indicator for accessibility under Article 9 of the Convention is the enactment of legislation that ensures accessibility. So again, all of this just to say that having a enforceable, strong, effective piece of legislation on accessibility is a standard. and any other guidelines or principles and so on should act as a supplement or complement to the legislation, not a replacement. The other point I wanted to discuss under Article 9 of the Convention, which again, most of you would be familiar with, is on accessibility, is the issue of who has the responsibility to take action towards disability and to, again, take action towards removing barriers to accessibility. And that very much is the state. So the onus should be on the state to remove barriers to accessibility. Article 9 obviously covers universal design, but again, the onus, the initiative should be from the state to take legislative and other measures to adopt universal design and to enforce it. And unfortunately, the current bill as is, it does place the burden on the community to identify, report, follow up for the removal of those barriers to accessibility. Sorry, I'm just going to check the time.
Yeah, no, you're a little bit over time. I was going to call your attention to that.
Okay, I think I'm happy to stop here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I will pass the word now to Warren. I can see you put a comment on the chat as well, sharing the United Nations recommendations from the latest report, the periodic review report. Warren, do you want to talk to that? And please give your initial assessment.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko ora posta toko ingoa. Hi, I'm Warren. I may have met many of you before. This is an area I'm particularly passionate about. But before I go into the specifics of the UN committee, what I'd just like to do is to frame what I think accessibility can do to remove disabling experiences. Now, those disabling experiences are the negative experiences people have when their impairment interacts with all of the issues that society creates to create the disability. So accessibility can't do everything. My view is that we need a system of enforceable rights as well. And I recently had a paper on this publicly released, calling for a system for enforceable rights to healthcare, social support, financial support, and habilitation. The reason that I think that's important is that a person should be able to enforce against the state those critical things. It's designed around the original idea of the ACC system, but available to everyone with impairments. And I say impairment should be defined very widely. So that's the system of enforceable rights. Then we have the system for accessibility. The accessibility system's different. The person shouldn't be enforcing that against the state. The state should be identifying, with the help of disabled people, and removing barriers that exist. That was the idea 5 years ago when we developed the idea of a framework legislative model. That was the idea of what accessibility as a bill or legislation would do. Now, that's a system where disabled people can say, hey, here's this negative thing that's happening, and can someone please figure out how to remove it? And we can help with that, but it's not the disabled person's job to fight against someone else. In the same way that if a crime has been committed, it's not a person's role to fight against and prosecute that. It's what the state does. So the state steps in and they take action to remove the barrier. But the critical things there is there has to be enforcement. Now, not everything has to be enforceable, but there has to be a way to enforce things. And then there has to be a way for the state to know that there's a problem. And rather than creating a system where disabled people have to go to their organizations, have to go to the committee, have to convince them, we say it should be very easy to say, hey, here's this barrier I'm experiencing. Can someone go and do something about that? And in the same way, there's not one single barrier, there's not 5 barriers, but these are things that disabled people can identify over time, because new barriers will emerge that we haven't thought of yet as technology changes and so on. And the third critical idea is this system of non-discrimination, which already exists under the human rights system, where you can say someone's discriminating against me. Now, a way that these three systems for enforceable rights and accessibility and non-discrimination would work, if you take the example of housing. For a disabled person to have a house, which is a requirement of the CRPD and so on, and for housing to be accessible and actually to live in a house, what we need is income so that we can either pay a mortgage or rent, which we get through the enforceable rights system. We need to have hundreds of thousands of accessible houses, which we will only get through an accessibility system. And we need landlords not to discriminate. So that's an example of how we need these three systems working together to remove these disabling experiences. I'm going to put some links in shortly, but I just want to come back to a couple of things that I think are critical. At the moment, the legislation defines specified entities, and that's basically the government. Now, we already have an accessibility charter that the government has to comply with. So the legislation as it stands now will not add anything unless we change the definition of specified entity. So that's one of the things I invite you to think about when you're writing your submission. The next thing is only government agencies have to give any information to the committees. So if we change specified entity, then everyone who's specified will have to give information. Now, the next thing is that how do people who experience accessibility barriers do something about it? This legislation doesn't provide any clear pathway for that. It says there will be a committee that will know everything. They'll know what the barriers are. But how does that help? Who's going to administer the process where a disabled person has a negative experience and has to tell someone and then has to do something about this? So we designed a system where we would have what we called non-enforceable standards, which is what we start with. Then we move through a process of making them enforceable. So we can do 20 non-enforceable standards next year, and then pick the ones that need enforcement first and move them forward. That was the model that we developed. So I would strongly suggest that if you're interested in this, to go to a select committee, to make oral submissions, to tell them whether you think it should be enforceable, whether you think it should apply wider than the government, and whether you think there should be a way that you, with your experiences, can move things forward and someone actually has to do something about it. So I've just seen a comment from Callum there. The idea that we've had non-enforceable government web accessibility, I agree. But the web system will change quite quickly. But anyway, that's probably my 2 minutes up, 4 minutes, sorry. But just to come back to what I put up earlier, we did speak to the UN country rapporteur about it, and the committee did make observations and it made recommendations. And its recommendations were to speak to disabled people and ensure that their concerns are addressed through the bill. And that's one of the critical things that needs to happen now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Warren, for your contribution. I will pass the word now to Jonathan. You have 4 minutes for this initial assessment.
Thank you so much. Kia ora koutou katoa. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. And I should say that I am here in an individual capacity as somebody who has chalked up a few legislative victories in my time, and also somebody who has developed and monitored accessible technologies over the years. Many people agree that the bill now before the Select Committee isn't what anybody asked for. At best, it won't make a difference to our lives, and at worst, it could do harm by creating bottlenecks. But I think that this process has suffered from a lack of government-led, truly inclusive consultation with the wider disability community, and that even the accessibility legislation, the kind of framework that Warren so eloquently just talked about, isn't the best solution to solve the problems that we all know exist. One thing disabled New Zealanders know all about is fragmentation. If a piece of equipment is going to improve our lives in some way, we often find ourselves caught in an argument between entities about who should pay for it. If you're disabled because of an accident, what you're entitled to is different from those whose impairment is congenital or medical. There are many other examples of this unfairness and confusion, and accessibility legislation could possibly create more. To give you just one personal example, back in 2018, I objected to receiving an inaccessible code to complete the census, while my census code was passed on without my consent to a disability agency. There were several agencies that I could have gone to for help, including the Human Rights Commission, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, the Ombudsman, and of course, Stats NZ itself. I chose to take it to Parliament and appeared before a select committee. I had experienced discrimination personally, but the problem was also systemic. Having a standard making it clear to Stats NZ what their obligations are in terms of providing accessible content would have been invaluable, no question about that. But creating yet another mechanism that I might have used to lodge a complaint would have just confused matters further, particularly for people less confident about advocacy. I have many similar examples. I can foresee a nightmare scenario where we're bounced from agency to agency because they've got a full load of complaints and they think that some other agency is a better fit for our complaint. I've been told by people in Canada that this is exactly already what's happening with their federal accessibility legislation, and they're just getting going with standards. Instead, I propose that what we need is consolidation, not further fragmentation, and that the consolidation has to be rights-based. Now, a lot has happened since the Human Rights Act was passed in 1993. We have regularly updated disability strategies, attitudes have improved, and we have the UNCRPD, of course. It would be a mistake to separate accessibility from a rights-based approach because accessibility is one of the most fundamental human rights disabled people should expect. We need to create new civil rights legislation that makes the rights articulated in the UNCRPD truly real. It would cover the very important needs of accessibility standards, but it could do so much more. We need to move to a civil rights approach with not just a mediation service, but an advocacy service that protects, promotes, and enhances our rights. That should include funding disabled people to have legal representation when making a complaint. Where a breach of those rights is identified, the individual discrimination can be addressed while also feeding in to any work on systemic standards that minimize the chance of discrimination occurring again. In short, the legislation I propose would articulate the rights, define the standards to make those rights real, and be clear about the mechanism for enforcing those standards. Let's ask for the current bill to be withdrawn and have a truly disability-led, fully open corridor about bold new legislation that enshrines our right to a good life. Now, it'll take a while, but the changes will be so significant that it will be worth the wait and worth the mahi. Some say that, well, we've got this far now, let's try to make the current bill work. That would be a colossal mistake that could set us back for generations. ACC was supposed to cover the congenitally disabled at some point soon. That was said over 50 years ago. The past teaches us that we must get it right the first time because who knows when we'll have another chance. As we head into an election year, the time is now. We are a quarter of the population. If we choose to use it, we have a lot of power, and this is our time. Let's not squander it. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your insights about, a different angle. Now, I would like to pass the word to Esther Woodbury for her initial assessment. And after that, we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. Thanks for coming, Esther. Hello. I can't hear you. Can you try again? I think now I can hear you. I could hear you. No. You are muted. Nothing coming. Sorry, our IT support, can you guide her? She might be having the same issue that Olivia had at the beginning. Did you check? Have you tried to plug and unplug your headset?
Have. Can you hear
Oh,
me?
now we can hear you.
Oh, amazing.
Yay.
Okay, well, that's a great start. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Finally. Nō te whanganui a tara aho ko Aote kai tohu tumuaki o hauatanga mō kahui tikatanga ko Esther Woodbury taku ingoa. Lovely to be here. Thank you, everyone. I am from Wellington. I work as the lead advisor disability rights at the Human Rights Commission. My name is Esther Woodbury. I am a Pākehā woman with glasses, and I was wearing a headset a minute ago, but I've had to take that off. I have a black and white dress on with a blue scarf, and my background behind me is a panel with, I would say, grey and green koru kind of design. So, but it's quite hard to really have a good sense of colours in this video setting. Thanks so much. Now I've been asked to talk a little bit about the Human Rights Commission and some of the way that we approach issues like accessibility. So the Human Rights Commission in general is to, our role is to promote and protect human rights in Aotearoa. We receive complaints and inquiries, and we monitor progress against the UN conventions and declarations that the New Zealand government has signed up to, meaning that they've agreed to progress these conventions to make them real for all people in New Zealand. But obviously some of the conventions focus on specific groups within society. And I just want to point out that when we say that the government has agreed to progress this, quite often in human rights, you'll hear this term progressive realization, and the government will say we are progressively realizing the rights of one of this convention. So for example, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But the language of the UN, which is a fascinating system, and it's really a system that helps articulate and create norms for how we want to be in society, how we want people all over the world to be. So when they talk about progressive realization, actually we don't mean that one day that should happen, but actually governments have a responsibility to move as quickly and effectively as possible to make the rights that that they have signed up to, to make them real for all people in Aotearoa. So so that's the kind of system that we work in terms of promoting and protecting people's human rights in Aotearoa. We do some education around what people's rights are, because of course one of the problems is that you can have rights, but if you don't know them and you don't know how to raise them as issues, then it's actually very easy for your rights not to be upheld. So, and I think others were 100% touching on this point, but yeah, so we need to know what our rights are, to be really clear about what they are, and if we don't feel that they're being upheld, what we can do about them. So the Human Rights Commission, receives complaints and inquiries. And what happens when they receive a complaint inquiry? If we say, yes, that is a complaint where you are being discriminated against on one of the under one of the parts of the Act, and I think there are 13 grounds of discrimination, and disability is one of those grounds, along with age, religious belief, sexual orientation, etc. So if disability is one of those grounds, you can say, I don't have accessibility in this public area of society, and therefore I'm making a complaint. What happens is that quite often things can be sent to a disputes resolution team. And the thing is that is for an individual complaint, like an individual person who has said, I'm being discriminated against, it's because I'm disabled, and it's not okay. So the disputes resolution service can get in touch with the people who you know, a person is believed that they're being discriminated against, and they can set up a conversation about, you know, can we sort this out quickly? Sometimes that will mean that a mediation is called, where the parties get together with one of the mediators here, and they talk it through, and they say, well, actually, this does appear to be discrimination on this legal ground, and you can't do that. So therefore, what would, you know, we want you to change your approach. We want you to change maybe the way your organization approaches things. We want you to apologize to the person and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of opportunities for a group of individuals, or an individual and maybe an organization, to kind of sort out a better way of being. And of course, that's like incredibly important, and it's a really important thing for disabled people to be able to have their rights upheld and to be able to make, you know, and sometimes those changes can be significant within an organization. An organization might say, we're going to send all of our staff on human rights training. We realize that we need to change our policies, but essentially what other parts of the Human Rights Commission do is work on the other part, the other roads that you can go down in terms of trying to make things different in society. And so a key one of that is that we do what we call systemic advocacy, where we say it's not just this one person who had that problem, and it's not just this other person who had a problem. Actually, this is a problem across society, and it needs to be changed, and it needs to, for example, there should be legislation around accessibility. It's a really classic example. And I think, as Lida already said, you know, there is the convention that the government signed up to is actually very specific around accessibility, including that the government must set minimum standards. So absolute minimum standards. You can improve, you're always going to be able to improve accessibility, but it's important to set minimum standards so that actually you can't go below that. You can't just sort of say, oh, well, you know, we'd like to put, for example, access to a building in. We'd like to have accessible information for our organisation on a website. Actually, if you can set accessibility standards, then anything that people can do above and beyond that is really advancing society and advancing opportunities for disabled people. But yeah, so that's like a really key part of what the UN has very specifically said, that it must be enforceable, and then it must set minimum standards, which of course the current legislation does not currently do.
Okay.
I suppose just a general point about the importance of engaging with this legislation in general, as with so many other things, is that civic and political engagement is fundamental to a democracy. And the thing about this legislation is that it's really important for us to engage with the political system. It's really important for us to engage in society around this, really important issue for disabled people or people who are going to be disabled one day, which is everyone, most likely. So it's not just important because it's an important issue, but without minimum standards of accessibility, civic and political engagement becomes impossible. Because people are not able to engage in their society. They're not able to connect, they're not able to understand, they're not able to express, they're not able to get into the select committee rooms to be able to take part in there.
To fully participate. Sorry, Esther, I will just interrupt now because you're a little bit over the time. And we already have questions in the chat, so let's get, from the panelists, whoever would like to speak first, just feel free to unmute yourself and we take turns. So Mojo Matters just put a question here. So the lack of any enforceability in the bill has been identified as a key flaw. It is feasible for an accessibility committee to have enforcement powers, or does that require a new body or agency to be set up? In which case, what is the minimum mechanism that would work to do enforcement where that is shown to be needed, such as a new government entity or accessibility commission? Who would like to speak to that first?
Well, in the absence of anybody else, I support the idea, this is Jonathan, I support the idea of a disability commission for the reasons that I outlined. I think a new entity that is specifically for us, driven by us, is appropriate. I think there are also dangers in whoever holds the whaikaha CE role having a role in the framework. And that's no reflection at all on the current occupant, who I have a lot of confidence in. It's just the position, because whaikaha is in charge of a lot of services. And so I think there is a potential conflict there where they may be asked to be held to account for the same framework that they are overseeing. So some sort of independent disability commission that handles rights and standards is, in my view, the way we should be going.
So a crown entity.
Yes.
Look, just to Tautoko Jonathan's point there, it's Warren here. I forgot to say earlier, I'm wearing a hat and glasses and have a beard, and I'm sitting in front of some pictures of the south coast of Otago. But look, absolutely, we need a body that is responsible for this. We initially suggested something like WorkSafe. What we suggested in our report is that you don't need to dismantle all the existing infrastructure. You can have, so if it's a non-enforceable standard, for example, that could be signed off by the CEO or minister or someone. It doesn't really need anything. It just needs agreement that this is something we're going to start with. If you want to have a regulation or an enforceable standard, for example, in transport, it makes sense that the minister in charge of this and the minister in charge of transport work together and have the existing infrastructure of that system. But it shouldn't be for the disabled person to have to navigate that. Someone needs to pick this idea up and say, that's where it needs to go. And then if there's not an existing regulatory system, for example, there's nothing that covers communication. So if we're going to have accessible communication, it needs someone to make a standard for that that's enforceable, perhaps. We can make a non-enforceable one. At the time it's going to become enforceable, who's going to do that? And so there are areas that we're going to find very quickly that don't already have a regulator. And therefore, if we have something like a commission that oversees this, that takes all of the complaints, that aggregates them, that then enforces it, that would be the way through. And it's very straightforward. It's not particularly expensive, and it can be set up from the beginning. That's my view on it.
Thank you very much, Warren.
If I could just add to that, just sort of supporting what Jonathan and Warren have said, and I just wanted to share a research I did last year for UNESCO, but it's specifically on access to information, so accessibility, just in the context of access to government information.
Just 1 second, Lida. That's a lot of reverberation. There's something wrong with your audio. I don't know if this is just for me.
It sounds like there may be two of you, actually. You might be on Zoom twice.
Sounds like
Yeah.
you have two. Let me just check. Oh, not too sure where. Can you try again?
How is it now?
Same. Do you have your phone maybe also open? No?
No.
Okay. Well, hopefully people will be able to follow.
Is it fixed? You understand me, or otherwise I'll just pass?
I think it will be okay because the captions can show what you're saying.
Okay. So what I basically wanted to support what Warren was saying, that sorry, just your face seems like the audio might not have been fixed. Okay, maybe it's my connection, so I might maybe just sit this one out and then try and speak later again.
That's okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not too sure what's going on with your audio. Okay, we does anyone else want to address that question, or I will go for the next one?
Can I just really flag that none of what anyone's talked about is particularly revolutionary or difficult. We have various commissions and regulators, and we can look at the functions of those organizations and apply them to this situation. Okay, so we're not asking the government in this respect to do anything that isn't already sort of in existence. It's not that hard, and it's not ultimately that revolutionary.
And Olivia, just touching on that, 2 years ago, we had a cabinet paper that basically said we're going to build WorkSafe to deal with accessibility.
Yeah.
And what then happened is it just got pulled back and pulled back and pulled back and pulled back. They haven't changed what we described as the legislative framework. Like, they still call it a legislative framework. It still has the language of that cabinet paper.
But no framework.
Just has no framework.
Yeah, where's the framework gone?
That's really disappointing. We have another question here from Sasha Dillon. Can the enforcement agency be whaikaha itself? I think that one was already covered by Jonathan when he was talking. Callum McMenaming. Hi, Callum. Thanks for joining us today. So, do human rights complaints have to be for an individual, or could they be for an entire class of people? Esther, maybe this question is for you. I think one of the things that actually, talking to Callum the other day, we were talking is, can we make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission, take government to the courts for not complying with the UNCRPD because lack of accessibility results in discrimination based on disability?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I'm definitely no legal expert about being able to take the New Zealand government to court over it. But I do know that absolutely a group or class of people can take a human rights complaint. There are some specific complaints going through that have started off with the Human Rights Commission and are now going to the Human Rights Review Tribunal, which can make whereas we don't have the power to make some kinds of recommendations. The Human Rights Review Tribunal can, for example, say here's an amount of money that a party must must give to the people who are making a complaint, or they can make recommendations like that. And so there is an organization who has made a complaint to the Ministry of Education around the enforceability of the right for people to attend school. And that obviously it's very complicated when you're taking a government agency to court. But yes, it is absolutely possible for a group to make a complaint and for it to progress.
Okay, let's get started. I have another question. Thank you so much, Esther. Anya put a comment here. She would like to hear the other panelists' response to Jonathan's proposal about, something similar to the American with Disabilities Act style law that will be rights-based with accessibility standards as part of it. I will go to you, Tanya, after this round.
Look, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, it's possible. We could have a single system that deals with enforceable rights, what I call enforceable rights, that deals with accessibility, and that deals with non-discrimination. The challenge is that when you have the delivery agency, for example, whaikaha, if it's delivering the services, it can't be the same one as is setting the standards and deciding whether or not they're being met. So you have to structurally separate these things somehow. But yes, it could be done under one. Principle 6 of my recent report talked about the need for coordination, and it said that you should have an enforceable system, an accessibility system, and a non-discrimination system, with a commissioner sort of sitting over top coordinating that. That's one option. There are a number of options that deliver it. We can argue about what service delivery mechanism, but we kind of need agreement that that's what we're doing first. That's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Does Lida, Olivia, or Esther would
My
like to
audio is working, I'd like to add to that.
Yay, it's working now.
Also, net connection issue probably. Just sort of following on what we discussed before regarding some kind of entity or entities that would enforce and implement, and now also in relation to having an ADA style system. Again, what we found specifically with regards to access to information was that, well, the committee's emphasis on the fact that, yes, as Esther said, minimum standards, but also enforcement of the standards, enforcement being the key word we've discussed many times so far. And something I don't think we've discussed is having appeal mechanisms available, because again, in those instances, so the systemic availability of accessibility where the burden is on the state, with more individual examples where reasonable accommodation might be needed, or when someone tries, a disabled person tries to access a service or a good, and if that request is not dealt with, they should be provided some kind of appeal mechanism. And again, that can be in the form of one single entity, or it could be in the sort of fragmented. For instance, we looked at information providers in different countries, and again, it could be the information commissioner, or in New Zealand, for instance, we don't really have that. We have the privacy commissioner and the ombudsman that deal with that side of things. So as I think Olivia said, it's not reinventing the wheel. It's not unachievable. It's actually quite achievable. It's just making sure that we do provide for it. And the other benefit of that, and I think that's sort of what Warren was saying in terms of having an overarching entity, is what the committee has been sort of increasingly emphasizing, again, in its comments and its concluding observations to countries, including New Zealand, is having data. There is a significant lack of reliable data on how many sort of complaints are even made, how they are dealt with, what is the level of accessibility. So having that entity that enforces the standards, it can also play the role of collecting and making sense of the data that can then be used for, further policy making and so on.
Thank you, Lida. Someone, Sally Brittle, make a comment here. Lida, can we now use Human Rights Commission or Health and Disability Commission to implement that enforcement?
I know that's addressed to me, but perhaps Esther can answer that better.
Currently, no. I mean, if there was a change to the Act, we wouldn't be able to without kind of that being added to our powers. And we have talked about some of the things that we would like to see, around better understanding of reasonable accommodation and that kind of stuff. Like, reasonable accommodation is required, but what that actually means in practice, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of scope to add to the Human Rights Act. I definitely think that, just to agree with others, it is about minimum standards, and it is about being able to enforce those minimum standards. But that role of education and promotion is so crucial, because it's for the people who need to know their rights, but also those that need to know their obligations as well. And I know that in some of the international jurisdictions where there have been different kinds of legislation and that kind of thing, that has also been an issue sometimes, where people don't necessarily know what they have to do, they don't know when they have to do it by, they don't know what to do, if they encounter something that's inaccessible and that kind of stuff. So you need lots of things propping up an enforceability mechanism.
Okay, thank you, Esther. Sorry, Tanya Ali, she's have her hand up for quite some time now. She's going to sign. She's very concentrated now. Okay, so I will go to the next question, and then when Tanya realizes that we're calling her, then she can make the question, if that's okay. Okay, so Vicky, hi Vicky, thanks for contributing with your question. How feasible is to get the present bill withdrawn and get them to go back to the drawing board? Is this a good idea or not? Shall we all put this in our submission? What is the downside? So I actually will complement to that question. Would be a possibility, but it's more about the parliamentary process. I'm not too sure, which panelists will be able to speak to that. If we do this approach of the rights-based approach, and we need to broaden the scope of the bill, so that will be catered for while they're doing the select committee process. You could have access to education, access to employment, access to health, access to housing. So it will be like a different way of framing it. Who would like to comment on Terry's question?
Happy to comment on this. It's Jonathan, since I introduced this idea. The Green Party chose to vote against the bill, and obviously the Green Party has been quite supportive of accessibility legislation as originally proposed. And I think that they did that because they came to a conclusion that the bill as it currently stands is not really salvageable. Even if you are a proponent of the accessibility legislation model, what's being proposed before the select committee and the concept that Warren and others took so much time to put together is quite different. And it's hard to imagine that you might get to a point where a lot of the amendments that proponents want are just out of scope because they're significant rewrites of big chunks of the bill. I mean, it would almost be a completely different bill in the core substance. And so then you get to the question, well, do we just shrug our shoulders and let this bill pass? And for the reasons that I outlined in my presentation, I think that would be a mistake because then it takes accessibility off the legislative agenda for the foreseeable future, and we would have squandered our chances in an election year. So if we as a disability community came up with a consensus that says we do not find this bill acceptable, actually what we would like is the government to lead a much more open consultative process to get a lot of people around the table discussing the issues like we are now, then we could do it. You know, election year's coming up, we could lodge a media campaign, we could talk about the accessibility challenges and the rights challenges that we face and the fact that this bill does not a thing to address them. In fact, there's nothing that couldn't be done in this bill without the bill. The minister can set up as many committees as the minister wants. So it really does nothing of tangible benefit. And I think we just need to hold our ground on this. It's too important to our daily lives not to put a stake in the ground and say, you've got to pull this inadequate bill and let's have a really genuine dialogue. And political parties are more likely to engage in good faith in that dialogue in election year than at any other time.
Thanks, Jonah, for holding your ground in your opinion. Yeah,
it's
Olivia.
Olivia here. Can I just add just another point to this? We've actually been told in the concluding observations from the UN committee that effectively this bill needs to be got rid of, and they haven't said just stop it, but what they have said is that the government needs to establish a co-design and co-production process with organisations of persons with disabilities to address concerns. That would not be something that is within the normal parliamentary process, but is certainly criticism from the committee about the lack of co-design and the lack of co-production within that process. Yeah.
Thank you. Warren, would you like to make a comment?
When this went to Cabinet, I sent an email to all of Cabinet. And I've done that probably 3 times in my career. And I said to them, this is a lost opportunity. This isn't going to be effective. You need to start again. I got a lovely reply saying, thank you, Warren. And if we would like your advice, we'll come and talk to you about it. They haven't. There's a view that there's no political will. And what I was told is that my email to Cabinet allowed this bill to get on the agenda. Because I said you need this, and the perception was we don't need anything, so we've got that. So I'm using my hands to visually explain. I said something that is massively in the future, but no one really wanted it. And Cabinet moved to the middle, but I don't think there's political will from the current government. And we either need to create that political will from the current government if we want a different bill, or to get other political parties to influence the current government. Now, I listened to it when it was introduced into the House, and there weren't very many people that weren't wearing a red hat standing up saying how great it was. Everyone else recognises the problems with this bill. So there is an opportunity to galvanise political support to do something different. There is a risk in abandoning this one and starting again. But what we have now won't work.
And I think that's something that everybody agrees about, that what we have right now won't work. The main question is, which path do we take as a collective? Because again, to solve this and to create this political will require a lot of noise. And I'm very thankful that we have staff connected here with us and TV1 News as well. And we need this conversation to come out from just, you know, like the disability community. It needs to go to, everybody needs to be talking about it. Everybody is affected by lack of accessibility somehow. Tanya, let's see now if Tanya can, she has her hand up for a long time. Cool. Yeah, you can make the question. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, thank you for your time. My name is Tanya Ali, and I live here in Wellington. And so really I joined this hui tonight to just talk all our disability community. And I'm seeing that there's some good positives that we can focus on, but in terms of focusing on the accessibility bill itself, and I feel like we need to grow the information that's accessible, and I hope that it is successful. I know, for example, we've talked about America, their standards are really successful, but it's kind of like we've got to push, we've got to give our community here in New Zealand a bit of a push so that we can see these barriers reduce, because I want to see more of a change for us all. And so that we can all have easier lives and we can be more inclusive with our disabled whānau. On my second point, in terms of accessibility, and accessibility for all, in terms of our deaf groups, we might have a large deaf community, but in terms of interpreters, there's only about 110 in all of New Zealand. And so with this disparity of numbers, how does this work? Sometimes interpreters might be required 24 hours. And this is either if they're freelance or part-time or through organisations like the New Zealand Relay Service. For example, if 3 or 4 deaf people wanted to book an interpreter at the same time, and they'll go through the appropriate channels, the first person might say, I want to book an interpreter for 10 o'clock. Or three people might come back and say, oh, I need to book an interpreter for 10 o'clock, but there's only one interpreter available, and which means that these 3 deaf people would have their time limited to 20 minutes each to be able to fit into this 1 hour slot. And so people might think, you know, people could argue that interpreters are costly and expensive. So I think some provisions should be made for the financial aspect of that. If we're talking about a Monday to Friday 24-hour service, that's fine. Interpreters being available through the weekend, that's an extra cost, which I understand, you know. and there's other costs and factors with that. But in terms of businesses and organizations, if a business is successful or not successful, will they be able to cover the interpreters, or will they require government help? For example, from an organization like MSD or the Ministry of Health. Or the Ministry of Education. Workbridge. We know Workbridge is a big problem. And if there is one person who's independent and wants to ask Workbridge, and knowing that Workbridge has the funding, but there's only a small amount of funding that's available for that deaf person per year. And this funding usually follows its own structure. And the funding usually runs out in, say, 6 months if this deaf person has a particular high need for funding. So the funding amount is an issue itself. And because there's no funding, the deaf person then misses out, which means they would then have to wait for the next funding round, which is potentially 4 or 5 months away until the next year's funding comes through.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Tanya. Sorry. Do you have any questions actually for the panelists? Because I think you're going through in a lot of detail and we're having like a high level discussion here today.
Or maybe I can make one comment, Juliana.
Yeah, that would be great.
Which is just that, and thank you for all of the points that you raised, Tanya. They're really crucial. I think that I don't know enough about.
There's just not enough funding, not enough interpreters. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that, and I think that obviously Warren has been thinking about this a lot, is that also that this piece of legislation, no individual piece of legislation is going to fix all of the problems in society, you know, for disabled people. And I think that it can go a really, really long way, but we also have to think about that kind of continued advocacy and monitoring from our perspective, from the Human Rights Commission's perspective. We have to think about that continued monitoring and advocacy in lots of different parts of society and lots of different parts of government. So, you know, in an individual situation, you should be able to say, I'm not getting my rights met. I'm not being able to enjoy my rights. But there are lots of ways in which we can say as a society, to government, we need to proactively do something. We can't just, and we need to proactively support more sign language interpreters to be trained, to have, for people to be able to access it, to have funds to be able to, and that kind of thing. So I think it can be really tempting to want to see a piece of legislation as being able to solve everything completely. But I think there's heaps of work that we need to do around, advocating and, hearing those stories and saying, this is not enabling us to realize our human rights. Even if we have the right to an interpreter, if there are not enough interpreters, or if there are.
And build capacity.
Can I just jump in as well?
Yeah.
Just one, if we had a communication standard that was enforceable, then we could say, hey, government, hey, business, you're not communicating effectively. But we don't have a communication standard, and we don't even have any way at the moment to make a communication standard, because there's no existing organization that has the legislation making power to make an enforceable standard for communication, which is why this bill will fail. It won't work. Separately to that, I say, just like if a person is deaf from an accident, everyone in the deaf community has the right to social support and habilitation, is what I suggest should be the case. So you should be able to say, I need someone to communicate with me. You have no standard that will do that, so give me someone. And that will very quickly turn everyone in the system's mind to thinking about how we can communicate more effectively with deaf people. But at the moment, none of those things exist, and this legislation won't create them.
Thanks, Warren. There's a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm sure we won't be able to address all of them tonight. So I might later on carry on with communication with the panelists so we can get back to the people that put the questions in the chat. Yeah, so it's a challenging times, right? What to do? Well, from the Access Matters perspective, what we've been trying to do is, first of all, is to broaden the scope of the bill to cater for enforceability. So we create a petition that has already over 10,000 signatures. I will put in the chat, because one of the concerns is that when people make the submissions, a lot of the things that we saying that we would like to see in the bill might come out of scope. And I wonder if this petition wouldn't be able to broaden the scope to even cater for this rights-based approach. If we're talking about access to employment, what do we need to have access to employment? Or access to education, or access to communication, as Warren was saying now. So I would like to hear from the speakers, from the panelists, if we could do this twist, and then our submissions will be considered by the select committee. The other thing that I just put in the chat is and we really encourage everyone attending this session today, is to make a submission. Access Matter has created a quick form to make life easier, and we want every submission to be unique. So you can start, sharing a little bit about your personal story, what are the access barriers, and what is the impact that they had in your life. And one thing that is really, really important is to put yourself out there to make an oral submission. So to let the committee know that you would like to speak or to sign, or whatever the way you communicate. The other thing is, we would love to recruit some volunteers, especially if there are law students here today in this panel, that we could pair up with people with disabilities that might need some assistance to make a written submission. So we can have people, collaborating to participate in the democratic process. So back to the panelists. Is it a possibility to, if we manage to broaden the scope of the bill, to do this twist, and instead of only focusing on it's not only focusing on the accessibility, it's that we change the focus for the accessibility to all the rights that are in the UNCRPD. If people want to volunteer, how they can get in touch. So I put on the chat, there is a link. You see, there's 3 links. One is the link for the petition. I will give you now a few seconds if you want to jump in there and just sign now, so you don't forget. Then there is a link to make a submission. that will lead you to this quick form. And then there is a link to register as a volunteer. Okay, back to speakers. Anyone would like to comment? And you can do our final remarks as well, because we have only 9 minutes left. I think we could spend the whole night talking about this and just getting getting questions, but the time is short.
Juliana, it's Olivia here. Can I just jump in just as a final comment? I'd really like to reiterate your point about making every submission unique, because if they're just standard generated responses that are all the same, the committee can very sort of easily put those aside and just say, oh, well, there's nothing kind of new or much that those add. But if everybody puts their experience, puts their voice into it, that has, a much more kind of fundamental effect to the way that the select committee views the responses. Yeah, so I'd just like to reiterate that.
Thanks, Olivia.
Juliana, Jonathan, I'll make some final comments. Just to remind people that if you want to, you can in your submission ask to be heard, to give an oral submission to the select committee, and they might give you 5 minutes. But, I think that you can also participate via Zoom these days, and I'm sure that they will go out of their way to provide an exemplary process so that people can participate in the way they feel most comfortable. So do tell your story. I would welcome the idea that the petition could be extended to include a civil rights, disability rights framework. I'm not sure whether some, though, might feel that kind of tampers with the kaupapa of Access Matters and the Access Alliance, what they've been working on for the last 5 years or so. So that will be up to the people who are in charge of that campaign. The one thing I'd say, though, is that I have been hoping for a long time for a process similar to many that I've been involved with, where the government goes out and they hold hui across the country and they invite anybody who's interested to come along. And this is not just a disability thing. I've been to meetings about the new framework for compensation for the income insurance scheme, digital poverty, all sorts of things, sometimes involving disabled people, sometimes not. And the government goes out and holds these wide open meetings where people can participate. And there's been no such thing in this whole building up of this legislation. And I think that's a flaw. I was once a chair of a DPO before they were called DPOs, and I passionately believe in disabled people getting together as a collective entity because there's strength in numbers and there's solidarity. I believe in that. I believe in the union movement, but I also believe that every person in this country, disabled and not, is a taxpayer. And as a taxpayer and a citizen or a resident, they're entitled to have their voice heard. They're entitled to join a collective if they want to, but they're also entitled to have a way as an individual to state their case. And there has not been that opportunity before this bill was actually introduced to Parliament. Had there been, I think we might have avoided this major cluster shambles that we've now got. And we might have got a bill that was worth saving.
But let's not lose the hope. We just had the first reading. We have, we have 20 days to make submissions. So people, sleeves up and let's get making submissions. The other thing I was going to say is, in conversation with the Social Services and Community Select Committee, they are planning to go to regions for the oral submissions. So, and they probably will make the decisions based on the amount of submissions coming from each region. So if you want the committee to come to your region, get your friends to also make submissions to the bill. Warren, would you like Esther make your final remarks before we close? We have 6 minutes. Oh, Kai, sorry, you have your hand up.
Just wondering, have we reached a consensus on whether the majority of us will be opposing the bill going forward, or seeking amendments to it? I mean, I know, you know, we'll have a range of views, but have we had a voter or something to sort of indicate what people think is the most effective way of doing it? Because like I'm drafting a submission for another group, and I would like to be able to fairly represent what the majority of people I've heard from say, but at the moment it's a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah, well, I can talk from the Access Matters perspective, and we will support the bill with the appropriate, you know, like with changes. But I think it's not a call for this panel to tell people what they, you know, what they should do. It was a conversation to give different perspectives and different views. It's not crystal clear for all of us, you know. Removing the bill has pros and cons. Going ahead with the bill with amendments has pros and cons. It's, yeah, but it's not, I don't think it's from this panel. We should not be telling people what to do, you know. Lida, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Juliana. So this is Lida. I just wanted to agree with what others have said. And well, first of all, the bill can be withdrawn, because I think that was a question someone had asked. It's not very common that select committees do that, but they could sort of disagree with it becoming the law and communicate that to Mr. Williams, for instance. And as Juliana said, I don't think it is for us or anyone to really tell others what they should, sort of whether they should ask for the bill to be withdrawn or amended. But I think what we could all do in our submissions is to point out the shortcomings as we've discussed. And also I would encourage everyone to mention and put the focus on the lack of a co-design and lack of what Jonathan was mentioning in terms of proper, effective, informed consultation with the community. And I think if that is really highlighted, even if the bill is withdrawn or it stops going forward, that would would provide a platform for picking up where it was left off. That this is not because there is, you know, it's not an impossible task, and that's why there is disagreement or criticism. It's that this is sort of what's been suggested to start sort of kind of from the beginning with a better informed approach to designing the bill.
Thanks, Lida. Okay, we have only 3 minutes left. I just want to add that realistically, it's very unlikely this bill will be withdrawn because Labour has majority in Parliament. So although, you know, it's not a bill that maybe anyone asked for, is the bill that there is in Parliament now. I think the best thing that we can do now is go really strong with the submissions, pointing out how ineffective it is and giving out suggestions how to improve it. Warren, would you like to speak? And then, yes, so we have 2 minutes because then we need to leave our New Zealand Sign Language interpreters to rest.
An observation first. There's almost 0% chance that this will be legislation before the election. It's unlikely that Labour will have a majority after the election. There's an opportunity to use the select committee process to really shape and collect the thinking of people here in Aotearoa. If we can use that select committee process and get a good report, then we may have the opportunity as well to get other political parties who may be in part of a coalition government after the election to shape their views and get their commitments. So there's potential to use the select committee to gather together the disability community about what they want, and at the same time use engagement with political parties to get their commitment about things going forward, and their commitment that this will be high on the priority list in any negotiation. Therefore, we will have accessibility legislation after the election, and that's possibly a way through.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
enlightening, Warren. Thanks so much. Okay,
You're muted, Juliana.
Thank you so much. We need to close now our Corero, but thank you so much for all of you that attended. And if you want to sign up as a volunteer and, would you like to carry on this conversation? I think it's very valid for all of us to keep in touch and carry on discussing which other ways we can make to have the realization of disability rights in New Zealand. So thank you very much. Thank you for our captioners, and thank you for our New Zealand Sign Languages. I hope everybody have a good evening tonight. Thank you.